Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to our first PA local event brought to you by Spotlight PA. I'm Christopher Baxter, Executive Director and Editor-in-Chief of Spotlight PA, and I'm so glad you've joined us this evening for a very special event. Tonight is also special to all of us because we're able to formally introduce you to our newest weekly newsletter, PA Local, which focuses on the amazing people, beautiful places, and delicious food our state has to offer. It's intended as a sort of break from all the heavy and difficult news we consume each day. And we at Spotlight PA have a lot of fun putting it together each week. So if you're not familiar yet with PA Local, you can check it out at spotlightpa.org/newsletters. For those of you who are new to our work or programming, Spotlight PA is an independent, nonpartisan newsroom producing investigative and public service journalism about the state capitol, urgent statewide issues, and the most pressing issues from various vital regions of our state. Spotlight PA is unique in a few ways. We don't try to write every story or barrage you with every piece of news. Instead, we provide contextual, deeply reported journalism that gets to the heart of problems, offers solutions, and drives positive change by empowering Pennsylvanians. We also aren't afraid to stand for something. We are nonpartisan and we have no preference for political party. We don't endorse candidates and we take no position on any policy. But we do believe in certain core values, like the importance of transparency in our government or the ethical conduct of our elected officials. We also believe that the more people who are informed and empowered to participate in our democracy, the stronger it will be. Our work is driven by a deep sense of public service, and it's powered by you, our members, and our readers. None of our work, this event, our many newsletters, our investigative journalism, our public service initiatives, none of that is possible without your support. So if you're joining us tonight and you're already a member, I want to extend to you a big thank you. It is a special, extra special day for us here at Spotlight PA because it is officially our 3rd anniversary. So those of you who are members are part of a pioneering group making Spotlight PA possible. And so on our 3rd birthday, we want to say thank you. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining us now. With your support, you can power some of the most impactful journalism in Pennsylvania and ensure we can continue to provide it all across the state at no cost. So I'd like to pause here for a moment and ask anyone who has the means to please make a gift now at spotlightpa.org/donate. Again, that's spotlightpa.org/donate. Your support allows us to put on events like this and allows us to continue in the belief that the facts are not a commodity that should be bought and sold, but rather something that everyone has a right to access. So again, if you can and are able, please support tonight's programming by visiting spotlightpa.org/donate. A few other housekeeping items. We are recording today's event to share with those who couldn't make it. Thank you to all who have sent questions in advance. If you have not yet asked a question, you can do so using the Q&A feature here in Zoom. To find that, just go to the bottom toolbar, click Q&A, type in your question, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. And with that, I'll turn it over to this evening's moderator, Spotlight PA's own Stephen Kearse, to take it from here. Stephen?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Kearse, Spotlight PA's assistant editor. So our event today focuses on the legacy of the Great Migration in Pennsylvania. The Great Migration was a period of mass movement by African Americans from the South to the North and West. When the migration began in the 1910s, 90% of all African Americans were living in the South. By its end in the 1970s, that number was a little over 50%. Millions of people moved to find better jobs and living conditions and relief from Jim Crow discrimination in the South. Their destinations were never paradises, but the migrants settled and made homes and later helped relatives, friends, and neighbors take the same trips. One of our panelists today, Dr. Armendia Dixon, is one of those people. She moved to Erie from Laurel, Mississippi in the 1960s to teach at East High School, and she still works as an educator in Meadville. Our other panelist, historian Dr. Clem Harris, joins us from Utica University. His work covers American political history with a focus on Black activism in cities like Philly and New York. Thank you so much for being here. And to our readers and audience, thank you for attending. Let's get started. So my first question is for Dr. Dixon. Can you tell us about where you were born and raised and what did it mean at the time to be a Black woman in America?
Yes, Mr. Pierce. I was born in Laurel, Mississippi, July 15, 1937. Before I could tell you what it meant to be a Black woman in Mississippi, I need to tell you what it meant to be a Black child in Mississippi. In our family, which consisted of my parents, Reverend Lou Edward Pierce, who was also a teacher, and my mother, Mrs. Denotrice Pierce, and 9 siblings, we were taught values that included spirituality, love of God and his creation, family unity, and respect for all mankind. We were taught we could be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, whatever we wanted to be, but we had to study and learn. You know, in fact, we were taught how to read and write before we went to school. Without going into a long story, we were to rise above the hateful name calling, separate but equal facilities, which really weren't equal, lack of inadequate housing, lynching, and the list goes on. To be a Black woman at that time in Mississippi was filled with challenges. You were expected to work as maids or servants, wash and iron for white people. If you got a college education, you were expected to attend a Black institution. Pay was always different, even if you were educated. Black women were subjected to the same Jim Crow laws as Black men. To change our segregated society in Laurel, Mississippi, our parents and other Black people created their own middle class, which put Laurel, Mississippi on the map. They brought in their own doctors, their own businessmen, dentists, and ministers. Oak Park High School became one of the most outstanding high schools in the South. That was what it was like in Mississippi at that time.
Thank you. What made you pursue education as a career path?
Oh my goodness, that's a long story, but I'm going to make it short. I finished pre-med at Jackson State College, an all-Black college. While on a waiting list for med school, I decided to pursue an English degree so that I could get through quick and teach and make some money. And I wasn't sure that I could wait for that opening in med school. But what happened was that I fell in love with the teacher education program. You know, my love for reading and learning and all, was fostered in this program. I love the honors program. I love student teaching. And I knew that this was where I was supposed to be. I knew that this was my calling. And I knew there was a reason for the waiting list. It wasn't that I was Black and I had to wait to get in med school. I had to wait because God was calling me to be a teacher. I loved it. So that's how I got into education.
Mm-hmm. Got it. You mentioned Oak Park High School. You taught there, right?
Yes, I did.
And as you taught there, you also you became the first Black staffer at Stainton Elementary School.
Yes.
What was it like going back and forth between those two environments?
Well, first of all, in 1966, the superintendent of the Laurel City Schools where I worked got a telegram from the United States government saying that the schools must be integrated immediately, and there would be no further extensions. The impact of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally trickled down to Laurel, Mississippi. I did not go through what students went through in New Orleans and Alabama. You know, I was asked in the middle of the night by the superintendent to come and help them to integrate the Laurel City Schools. You know, I wondered why the superintendent asked me to do this, especially since he was well aware of my family's involvement in the civil rights movement. Nevertheless, my life changed dramatically. I worried, my family worried for my life, but it happened. You know, my assignment was to work 1/2 day in the morning at Oak Park on one side of the railroad track, and 1/2 day in the afternoon at Stainton Elementary as a librarian on the other side of the track. In other words, the district was trying to figure out how to integrate and not integrate. I couldn't believe how I was treated though, especially by the teachers and the administration there. The principal spoke to me on the first day. She showed me the so-called library where I was to work. Then she said, you need to know that we don't want you here. We will not talk with you. You will not attend any staff meetings here, and you will not socialize with us. The students will not come in here when you are in the building. You know, one teacher broke the ranks and came into the library. She turned up her nose one day, she went around the room and she came close to me and then she said, "Oh, I smell something." Well, I came even closer to her and I said, "You know, you're closer to you than anybody, so you might be smelling yourself." Oh, she was so frightened that I would speak back and she ran out of the room. The only one ever to talk to me. But as for the students, they never came into the library, but they were the bright spot when I was there. As they passed my door following behind the teacher, they would smile and wave at me and I would wave back. I never saw a child pass my door who made a nasty face or a nasty sound. And I thought more and more, oh, if we could stay like these children. But then once those children became 12 years old, or even younger, they were taught that they should treat Black folk as their inferior. So going back and forth, as you asked me, made me more determined to be a reflective teacher, to care about others and to be vigilant in never thinking that I know it all and thinking about what I could do better. That's what was important, to be genuinely concerned about students and their families, to help to break down those walls that keep people apart, that keep people from learning about each other. So interestingly enough, even though I go back to Laura, Mississippi, I was inducted into the National Oak Park High School Alumni Hall of Fame in 2006. And following the ceremony, during the ceremony rather, the mayor presented me with the key to the city, city I grew up in. But following the ceremony, I was driven to Stainton Elementary School, where I was greeted by the principal, who was a Black woman, and she talked to me. We were two Black women who shared a physical space, Stainton Elementary School, and yet a different place in history.
Wow, that's quite an arc. My next question is for Dr. Harris. So the Great Migration was gradual. Everyone didn't leave at once. And it took place over the course of years and happened at different speeds and different places. Can you tell us about the factors, the broader factors that were encouraging Black people to move?
Yes, first let me say good evening to everyone and good evening once again, Dr. Dixon. It is a pleasure to share this platform with you. To your question, good sir, let me first problematize the periodization. To appreciate history, we must always understand the antecedent before we can actually understand the dynamic that we are focusing on. The gradualization of the Great Migration actually has its earliest roots in the period of abolition, otherwise known as the Underground Railroad, right? Now that's extremely important because you will find once we get to discussing the Great Migration that similar factors that prompted enslaved Black men, women, and children to leave the South had not fundamentally changed during the early 20th century. So to understand the Great Migration and the earlier periods is to understand that its earliest roots lie within the Underground Railroad and that gradual movement out of the Deep South into the urban north. And by the time we get into the post-Reconstruction period, the industrialized urban north was a fairly consistent pattern. But it didn't reach the major numbers until we start to move toward World War I. And there's several key factors for that. One has to do with recognizing that the immigration policies of the country changed. In fact, there was no longer, the United States was no longer allowing Europeans, ethnic Europeans, to come into the city. Europeans, and specifically ethnic Europeans, white ethnic Europeans, had long fulfilled key areas of labor as the United States moved from an economy rooted in plantation slavery to an economy rooted in industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism paid higher higher wages. And those opportunities were going to whites who were immigrating into the country, and as they settled, their descendants. But by the time we start moving toward World War I, that door was closed, and the nation needed to gear up to deal with preparation for World War I. There was a labor shortage. And as a result, the captains of industry sent their recruiters south, because at that time, the nation had roughly 10 million people of African descent in it. More than 6 million of them resided in the Deep South. In order to continue to help the nation prepare for World War I, in order to really help propel the World War I economy, there began this recruitment of Black people. And you can see people leaving from the Deep South along the along various rail lines, right? Rail lines have been used as a way to sort of understand where people were coming from and where they were going from the Deep South in the East, as you move more to the western part of the South, Midwestern part of the South, onto the western part of the South, and you could follow their trajectory. Those trajectories were largely heading into areas that we recognize as urban industrial centers, and they were largely there to provide the labor that was needed in order to propel the nation's industrial economy in preparation for World War I. But there's a key point here. The request for labor did not mean that they would get the same jobs and be paid the same as whites. Quite frankly, they got the worst jobs. The safety conditions that they faced, particularly in steel production, was extremely, extremely difficult. And on top of that, they were often denied the opportunity to live in communities that were white. This period is a period that ultimately marks how racial boundaries were established in localities, and they were enforced by everyday people. You might think about the significance of ritualistic murders, lynchings, race riots, all of these particular types of racialized, gendered form, and I would dare say also that these forms involved a type of, for lack of a better term, they involved a way to sort of police the sexuality of Black men for fear that Black men would engage in sex with white women. These types of violence sought to create what we recognize as the first ghetto, right? Concentrated pockets where Black people lived by virtue of race riots, by virtue of lynching, and by virtue of local ordinances that denied Black people the opportunity to move in communities where working class white people lived. I will conclude by saying this. One of the major reasons that brought Black people from the Deep South into places like Philadelphia and even Western northwestern Pennsylvania, like Erie, had everything to do with the industrial economy. But you should know, and your viewers should know, that if the draw for better paying jobs had been a factor, if the escape of violence against Black bodies had been a factor, the racism that existed in the South differed very little from the racism that existed in the industrialized urban North.
Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive. I actually have a follow-up question on that. So the Great Migration, as you said, it had roots in Underground Railroad, and it really picked up before and during World War I. And it's sometimes described as having two waves. So one during the period you mentioned, and then one after World War II. Were there differences between the waves, and were people going to the same places or working similar jobs?
So there were differences. One of the major differences has to do with how we understand the ways in which our urban centers move forward after World War I, right? There is this period in time between World War I and World War II called the Great Depression. And the Great Depression produces a major state response to the problems of the global economy and how the global economy failed in the United States. Once World War I kicks in, what we start to now see yet again is a major pull of Black people out of the South into the industrialized urban North. The difference now are the ways in which the federal government has become complicit in the development of new urban ghettos. When we look at depressed urban communities, like those that exist, I believe Franklin Street is mentioned as a key area in Erie where concentrated Black residency could be seen. And I think that one of the reports I read that the NAACP investigated on I think it's Franklin Avenue, rental housing that Blacks were staying in that were very much reflective of the type of rundown shacks that had housed Blacks during the post-slavery era, where sharecropping had become the main way in which Black folks could live. The difference between the first wave and then the Great Migration following World War I and the second really is based off of the ways in which the federal government began to become a major force in the shaping of racially segregated communities. This is where we see how the federal government in housing denies African Americans the opportunity to build wealth inside their homes. This is a period where we see a sort of intersection between the federal government, local real estate agencies, and local governments, and sort of enforcing racial covenants, even after the US Supreme Court said that racial covenants were illegal. This is a moment where we see yet again some of the most skilled industrial jobs being denied to Black people. And the denial was being made by the very companies that were charged with the responsibility to employ Black people. This created a moment where we see the development of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Federal Employment Practices Commission, where he signs an executive order that essentially mandates that any private company that is operating off of a government contract, if that company is engaged in racial discrimination, that it could potentially lose its contract with the federal government. Now, ultimately, they had not been enforced, but it is very, very key that one of the major differences between the first Great Migration that was triggered by World War I and the second wave that continues up through the 1970s is the role of the federal government as a major player in the perpetuation of anti-Black racism in the urban industrialized North.
Got it. Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Dixon. So, you made this journey we just described. What was it like getting settled in Erie, and what drew you there in particular?
My father had massive strokes in 1967 and was unable to work. We are sure that happened because of our involvement with the civil rights movement. My father helped with the housing of freedom riders who came down to Mississippi and in that area. We had a cross burned in front of the house. My father was really literally run off the highway one night, and the list went on. So because of these massive strokes, my father could no longer work. My take-home pay at the time was $200 a month. My parents couldn't make it financially. Two brothers had already left to work in Buffalo, New York, and they were helping some with the siblings. But now my parents needed more help. So given my experiences at Stainton Elementary School and the fact that I was not making a decent salary, it was time for me to go north and join my two brothers. In this way, I could help my family more. My brothers made arrangements for me to come and start applying for a teacher's position there. And you asked me, well, how did I end up in Erie? Well, in my community, we did what was called hop a ride. So if you went anywhere in this country and somebody thought that you could take one of their relatives along to drop off at another relative, then that's what happened. So the secretary at Oak Park said, oh, I understand you going to Buffalo. Can you take my son and drop him off in Erie? And I said, well, of course, I'll have company. So I took her son and I went to Erie to drop him off in the projects. And by the time I got out of the car, I heard somebody call my name. And I was sure that wasn't true. So I really didn't pay it any attention. So we went on, unloading the car. And by that time, that person was coming closer to me, and I knew that person called my name. And would you believe the person was my campaign manager when I ran for Miss Jackson State College. So it was Dorothea in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I thought, girl, you're in Erie, Pennsylvania. So anyway, she wanted to know what I was doing in Erie. And I told her why I was in Erie and I was on my way to Buffalo. And she said, Armendia, look, you're going to Buffalo? And and yes, I explained that I was going to Buffalo because I needed to find a job. She says, well, why don't you interview in Erie for a job? And I thought, no, I'm going on to Buffalo. And I understand anyway in Pennsylvania, if a Black person comes up and the Black person says, I teach, they'll make you go and take a test because they think you don't know enough. And I said, oh no, I got my teaching certification and I don't want to be bothered with anybody who thinks this way about Black people. So I went on to Buffalo after I let the young man off. And I told my brother what Dorothea said. And the brother that I was with that particular night said, well, okay, it wouldn't hurt. You're going to interview here, but it wouldn't hurt to interview there too. And this was my oldest brother. He was sort of like daddy. You say something, you listen to him. And he persuaded me to actually go back to Erie to interview. And my friend Dorothea, called the superintendent, and she said, I have somebody I want you to interview. And I thought, this girl doesn't know the superintendent. No way. So, but she's talking on the phone. And when she got off the phone, she says, Dr. Zipper, and his name was Dr. Zipper, by the way. She said, Dr. Zipper wants to interview you. I said, okay. So I went down to interview. And I think that interview lasted all morning. And then Dr. Zipper says, well, you know, could I see your credentials? Well, believe it or not, I didn't even bring my credentials. I forgot them. I left them at my brother's house. So Dr. Zipper said, well, you know what? If you have what you say you have, I'd like to hire you. so anyway, I didn't have to take a test, you know, and prove that I knew a little something. So that's how I came to Erie. And what was it like in Erie? My goodness, segregation was there too. It was subtle. And there were a few school riots between Blacks and whites when I got there. You know, I just left riots in Mississippi. It was difficult to find housing for Blacks. And more Blacks, though, were moving from Laurel to Erie. And we brought with us our workplace skills and our sense of community. And I have to say, though, the great thing about Erie is that I went to work at East High School, and the faculty members there were true colleagues. You know, I made lifelong friends there. One of my dear friends became mayor of the city of Erie, and another served as key researcher for me when I designed the Collegiate Academy in the Erie School District, while working as director of curriculum and instruction. So my goodness, we were becoming a community, and we were beginning to solve some of the problems. We were beginning to work together. And I think that this made a difference. African Americans began to serve on boards, and more teachers came into the city. And my goodness, it did make a difference. We have certainly made an impact in the Erie community. The great thing is I still have those lifelong friends like I do here. So, yes.
Wow, that's quite a story. I have a follow-up question on that. Oh, sorry, my question disappeared. Why were so many people coming from Laurel in particular up to Erie? Were they having run-ins like you did?
I think so. And I think by word of mouth, because we would go back and forth too. And there were some people who would actually sponsor people to come from Laurel, Mississippi, to live in Erie and work in Erie. And there were good jobs that were open to African Americans in Erie. So I am sure that made a difference. And it became home to so many of us.
Understood. My next question is for Dr. Harris. So can you tell us, what were the major areas in Pennsylvania that people were moving to?
So there were two primary industrial centers in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. But I do think, Mr. Kearse, that it is important that we really not lose the significance of what Dr. Dixon said in terms of how she made it up, right? The hop along to give the ride, right? That helps you to understand the key role that networking played in that move, that migration from the South to the North, right? That migration is really complicated in terms of our understanding, because it begins first from the rural South to the urban South, and then from the urban South to the urban industrialized North. But it didn't happen without some understanding of a network that was in place, particularly with regards to Black women and children, right? That network there had to be someone on the receiving end. And so that's really important that we don't lose sight of that. And that particular structure persisted from the early 20th century through the late 1970s. My parents migrated from the some from the Delta region in the Mississippi in the 1950s, and the others from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Same structure. So that's extremely important. But Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were the two primary industrial areas in urban Pennsylvania that Black people migrated to, largely because of the strength of their industrial economies.
Thank you. A follow-up question on that. You mentioned earlier that, things like ghettoization and segregation and restrictive covenants were shaping where people moved and where they could live. Can you talk about some of the local responses by city governments as people made this trip?
Absolutely. This requires that we think about this from the standpoint both of interracial lenses and intraracial lenses. Starting with intraracial lenses, we all like to think that, that there was unity across the Black community as Black folks were coming from different parts of the South, seeking to resettle in largely Black segregated areas in the urban North. And for a significant part of that, when you had pre-existing networks, resettlement did have a particular process, it had a particular tenor, but there had been issues that were shaped by class. And we should not lose sight of that, right? This resettlement from the South to the North did not happen within a Black racial lens in a very smooth manner. There were challenges that were there, and a lot of those challenges were the result of class factors. There were charges that many of the Blacks who were coming, particularly from the rural South, lacked a certain type of urbanity, a certain type of urban culture, and that tended to reflect negatively on these sort of middle-class Blacks for whom their time in building a life reflected a type of class aspiration that they were very, very protective of, right? Churches played a very important point in helping Black people to settle, right? So, in the absence of a type of romantic perspective and understanding Black unity, how did people get settled, right? Well, Black institutions played a key role. Churches, the Urban League, the NAACP, all of these areas, all of these institutions were key institutions that helped Black people get settled, particularly when they faced barriers within their own ranks from people who had taken advantage of opportunities to get education and jobs. Within an interracial context, we see a variety of challenges that Black people faced. Part of it had to do with the fact that segregation still existed within the public school system. Black students were not really allowed to go to predominantly white schools. In Philadelphia, I write about the significance of a type of white ethnic protectionism. Whites did not want Blacks moving into their communities. And so there was this urban resistance, this organic resistance to Blacks coming into their communities, while simultaneously the sort of progressive legislation that was coming out of the civil rights movements in the 50s and the 60s had significant limitations. Think about it in this context. Black folks who had been fighting against Jim Crow during that first wave of the Great Migration were able to take advantage of the openings created by the civil rights movement from the 50s through the 60s. But if you were born in the post-World War II period, and you were coming of age in the 60s, that door was closing, right? Not only was that door closing on opportunity, but you were still facing police brutality. I write about the era of police brutality when Frank Rizzo was mayor between 1971 and 1979. And in the long history of police brutality in that city, the city of Philadelphia has a history of roughly 300 years. The era between 1971 and 1979 was by far the most dangerous for Black people. Put it in this context. In 1970, between 1970 and 1978, the police fired their weapon 469 times, overwhelmingly in Black and brown segregated communities, right? The worst year was in 1978. 2 out of 3 Black people killed by the police, 2 out of 3 people killed by police in 1978 were Black, overwhelmingly in Black segregated communities. So the challenges that they faced from local governments did not ease their ability to settle and to develop families. Many of them faced deeply entrenched racial segregation, not only from the culture, but also from the local governments themselves. And I think that that's extremely important, because that legacy that we're talking about right now, that legacy that Dr. Dixon is talking about right now, that legacy of a Black person coming up from the South and coming into an industrialized urban North is still shaped by recognizing that one of the most significant hurdles towards resettlement is dealing with the proliferation of anti-Black racism in housing, in employment, in education, in healthcare. All of those were major factors that they faced as they moved from the from the urban South to the industrialized urban North, both in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh.
Thank you very much. So my last question, and then we'll move to audience questions, is for Dr. Dixon. And I just want to go back to something you said earlier about, people like you coming here and this place becoming home despite its difficulties. And could you tell us, how, what makes it home for you, and how did it become home?
First of all, I need to point out that once my father got better and began to recover from his stroke, my mother and father came to live with me in Erie, and so did my 2 sisters who were in college at Stillman at that time. So the family came here, and that was wonderful. One of my sisters, Ruby Jenkins' husband, became a councilwoman in the city of Erie, Pennsylvania. So the story goes on. We made our contribution here, but speaking about what made this place home, now you do know that I am now in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Okay, and this is where I work. I loved Erie. And first of all, and I thought I would never leave it. But then I married a born and raised guy in Meadville, Pennsylvania, by the name of Harrison Dixon. And so Meadville became my home. And I want you to know, we faced a few struggles here too, but then that's life. But my parents and the 2 younger siblings moved to Meadville also. So we're in Meadville. And I want you to know that I worked, and I still work with great teachers and administrators in Meadville. What a difference between Stanton Elementary School. I love my church and the organizations I serve here. And I believe that it is a beloved community that Dr. King talked about, because we are really trying to work together to solve problems together, and to, as as Dr. Harris talked about, to just keep trying to get things together the way they ought to be, where we can live together and work together and respect each other. So this is what makes this place home. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the first audience question is for Dr. Dixon, and it's from Luline Lamar, who asks, can you speak more about the housing difficulties you face, and specifically redlining?
Well, first of all, it was a given in Laura, Mississippi, that we grew up in what was called the KC Bottom, where the Leaf River overflowed, and the snakes would run down, and we had the outhouses. Oh my goodness, the story is more than I can ever tell today. But in order to get Blacks out of the KC Bottom, then the government built projects just for us, and only Black people could go to those projects. And of course, the other project on the other side was for Blacks, and different for sure. And of course, when I came to Erie, that was also a problem. There were only certain places where Blacks were welcome, and I remember that a group of us got together and as educators and sat down and talked about this being a problem. And I want you to know, we came up with some strategies for dealing with that. And it took years, but my goodness, I think we all begin to see, well, this isn't the way to do this. You can't ostracize us. You can't put us in a certain place and think that this is where we're supposed to be. And yes, and it still happens somewhat, but it happens a little bit here in Meadville, but that's something we keep working on. And you can't just sit still and let things happen. You have to work on problems. You have to solve problems.
Thank you. The next question is from Frank, who asks, and you kind of just touched on this, but he asked specifically about your experience in Erie's public parks. What were what was there segregation there, either de facto or explicit?
Is that my question?
Yes.
I didn't really experience too many problems as it related to the parks. I do recall our having to work on a swimming pool project because for some reason African Americans weren't allowed in a certain pool. They weren't welcome there. But again, I think that we have to always stop and deal with problems. Don't let them keep piling up. And of course, we got together about that pool too, and about that park situation. And it wasn't long before it was resolved.
Understood. Thank you. The next question is from Dan C. And Dr. Harris, I'll ask you this one. Can you expand on what some of these riots in northern cities looked like?
So the question is, can I expand on? Yes. I think the best way to understand this is first to talk about the dynamic of riots in the post-war during the World War I period. It is the result of migration, right? Whenever you have mass movements from one area to the next, you are going to have tension as we start to think about the significance of resettlement. But in the case of race relations in this country, because racism is about racial subordination, Black people moving from one area to the next challenges the authority of a white society that has long held the privilege of defining who gets to occupy space, who gets to have access to various types of resources. During the period of the First World War, the race riots were largely the result of rumors that somehow a Black man had made an untoward statement toward a white woman, or had walked in a particular part of the town or city that was deemed to be a whites only. And that movement was going to be policed, not by the authorities, but by the community itself that had the blessings of the authority. We see that in the early 20th century in East St. Louis in 1917. We see it in Philadelphia in 1918. We see it in Chicago, called Red Summer in 1919. And arguably last year, as we celebrated the centennial of Black Wall Street, we saw it in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But that was just a few examples. These types of race riots happen in 100 different localities during that particular period. I want to go a little further, because we are now just coming off of a period where we have seen major racial tensions during the COVID era. And we've seen a particular politic in this country that has regressed us back to a period in time where these types of racial attitudes had become mainstream. And arguably you could say that a lot of the fringe racial ideologies that we thought we had gotten behind, we thought when Obama was elected that we had entered into a post-racial moment. We thought that all of these things were behind us, only to see that they had not been. And the major flashpoint had been the role of the state and the way that it policed the Black body. Think of it this way. The election of Obama changed the political trajectory of this country because a particular achievement had been hit, a particular state of progress had been hit. If you follow civil rights history, you will find that for every progressive racial step, there is a retrogressive response, right? The trajectory of racial progress in this country is not linear. It takes a very, very complex process forward. And so the racial riots in the early 20th century represented the positive racial steps that have been taken in this country during Reconstruction. Post-Reconstruction sought to pull that racial progress back. In the late 19th and early decades of the 20th century represented that until the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement that sought to bring forward the very racial progress that the nation sought to do in the 19th century. Once we got into the late 60s and early 1970s and 80s and 90s, the rise of George Wallace and Nixon and Reagan, we saw a retrenchment on racial progress. Now move it forward to Barack Obama. The election of Obama, the conclusion of that election following 2 terms brought us once again a type of retrogression in race progress and the election of Donald Trump, right? And so these types of racial conflicts are consistent with the progressive racial steps that the country takes. I think the simplest way is to understand it this way. Racial progress will only be accepted in this country when the majority of citizens ultimately make it so. What I teach my students is this. It is difficult to change a law by any stretch of the imagination. We've learned that now, seeing how the George Floyd Reform Act has now become dead in the Senate. Following that, we see Jalen Walker in Akron, Ohio, shot at 90 times and hit 60 times as a result of a minor vehicle and traffic accident. But as difficult as it is to change a law, it is easier to change a law than it is to change a culture. I want to say that again because I want your viewers to understand this. It is difficult to change a law, but it's easier to change a law than to change a culture. Anti-Black racism did not begin in the South. It began in the urban North. It did it once the North ended slavery, and it is still with us here today.
Thank you. All right, final question is from David M. And it's kind of related to the trajectory you just laid out, Dr. Harris, and either one of you can answer it. But what is the path forward as you see it, and how do you kind of stay grounded and commit to changing things?
Dr. Dixon, if you want to respond, I will respond after you, ma'am.
Go right ahead, Dr. Harris.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
Education, Mr. Kearse, is key. Education is absolutely key. I cannot tell you how many of my students, as Director of Africana Studies, who teaches why there must be an African-American history, why there must be a Black woman's history. I can't tell you how many of them raise the question, why wasn't I taught this in high school? Why? And even once they get to me in college, these are electives. They're not mandated to take the course, right? And as important as those conversations are, good sir, the most important conversations are not that which takes place in my classroom. It's what takes place over the kitchen table. Kitchen table conversations about how we must all see each other's difference, not as a threat, but as a possibility to grow from, as a way to strengthen who we are as human beings, as a way to ultimately recognize that we should not be afraid of the differences that we represent, but that we should all find a way to capitalize on that. Put it in this particular perspective. Imagine how strong the US economy is right now. It is the strongest economy in the world right now. But if you were to take out racial discrimination, if you were to take out gender discrimination, you will now have the strength of that economy doubling, because now people are not faced with discrimination based off of the color of their skin, based off of their sex and or gender, right? These conversations are important, but they're rooted in the absolute significance of everyday conversation coming from informed people that are not teaching myth or talking myth, but are unafraid to deal with the complexities of the human condition and the complexities of human history. We cannot, for simplicity's sake, give romantic histories because they sound good. We must be willing to engage the complexity. Those conversations must take place with family members, and I say the kitchen table because it's easier to have a conversation when you're feeding someone than when you're not.
Absolutely. And it's amazing that we've gone far away from the fact that genetically we're all alike. My goodness, we're all alike. And why can't we, as you said, Dr. Harris, just get to know each other? And if we do, we will discover that we all have so much in common, and we could help each other to grow, and we could be a strong nation, a strong country, strong citizens, strong cities by working on that particular fact that we're all people, we're all alike. We love each other. My goodness, we can if we get to know each other. So this is what we need to do. And when you talk about curriculum, you know, that's my favorite subject. Oh my goodness, in the classroom, we have to teach students to respect each other, to love each other, to care about each other, to value the history of each other. My goodness. Oh, wow. We will become the nation we're meant to be if we do just that.
Well, thank you very much. This has been very engaging and enriching. I'm going to turn it over to Chris now. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Stephen. We're at the end of our time together this evening, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for what I think we'd all agree was a really fascinating and gripping conversation. I want to thank Stephen and both of our panelists for generously giving of their time, experience, and expertise. I think we're all grateful that you've taken some time to spend it with us and our readers. Central to the mission of Spotlight PA is ensuring that Pennsylvanians in all corners of the state, regardless of their financial resources, have access to trusted, nonpartisan, fact-based journalism to be informed, equipped, and empowered in everyday life. So as we like to say at the end of all of our events, this conversation was just the beginning. The future of journalism, and indeed our future at large in our state, will depend on a shared commitment to the truth and a free press. So we invite you to stay engaged with our team, and we welcome your suggestions about how we can continue to best serve the community and put on more events like this. Everything we do at Spotlight PA, we do as a free public service. And so this is the time I'd like to remind any of you who have not yet made a contribution in support of this event tonight and future events to please do so at spotlightpa.org/donate. Contributions of any amount help us keep this programming free and available to all, and your support goes directly back into our work and our journalism. Have a great end of the week and long weekend, everyone, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye all.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.